Good afternoon and welcome to the Winter 2022 Daynard Community Lecture. Twice a year, the Daynard Distinguished Visiting Fellows Program brings nationally recognized public interest leaders to campus. These public interest leaders serve as role models for students, demonstrating how legal skills can be used effectively and creatively to make the world a better place. The fellows each deliver an address that focuses on the strategic use of law to promote public interest goals. Participate in a roundtable with other prominent public interest advocates, visit classes, consult about professional opportunities for students and graduates, and meet individually with interested faculty, administrators, as well as students. We so deeply appreciate the generous support of Professor Richard Daynard and Carol Daynard. I think it's right there. Let's give them a clap. For making this series possible. We also appreciate the contributions of the Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration, Lucy, and the Public Interest Law Scholars Program to organizing this event. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, class of 1999, our Winter 2022 Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellow. Keesha is the director of the Democratic Practice United States program at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, where she works to advance measures and ideas that improve democratic systems and engage democratic culture in the United States to support full and fair democratic and economic opportunity for all residents. Keesha is a longtime organizer, lobbyist, and trial attorney. Prior to joining the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, she was senior counsel with the Brennan Center for Justice, serving as the director of redistricting and representation program. She also served as executive director of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota and as the executive director of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. She worked for several years as a civil trial attorney and also served as a special appellate public defender for the state of Minnesota. Keesha is a frequent lecturer and writer on issues related to women and politics, movement building, and democratic reform. She is the author of numerous articles and publications related to voter suppression, voting rights, and is a frequent commentator on voting rights reform, and regularly appears on numerous news and public affairs programming, including appearances on PBS's NewsHour and MSNBC. Please join me in giving Keesha a warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I come from a call and response culture. We're gonna try this one more time. I know I'm amongst friends. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Right on. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Professor Williams, Professor Dean Hackney, Professor Daynard and Carol, and to the NUSL community. It is a huge honor to be here and to wander around the halls I thought I knew so well and managed to get lost in very short order. I want to share some thoughts with you about the 21st century democracy in the United States. As we think about the needs the needs for future democracy in the United States, I want to orient the discussion a little bit around my point of view. Dean gave us a background, my background, and so I've worked in various levels of civil society and civil society spaces, but I spent the last 10 years almost working in philanthropy and in philanthropic spaces. And through that, I worked in a program called Democratic Practice. And that is not the same as simply democracy funding or democratic systems, right? It is looking at democratic systems and looking at democratic culture and where these things cross over and what is the practice of democracy in the United States. Not merely just what are the systems, how do we vote, or the civic engagement questions, how do we engage around community gardens, engagement, public centers. It's really a combination of both. I've had the honor as well as taking on the Racial Justice Initiative for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for the past 3 years. And that's a time-limited program focused on addressing questions of racial justice in the United States. And my work leads me to arrive at the inescapable conclusion that our democracy, economy, and questions of racial justice are inextricably linked. You cannot have success in one without success for all. Rashad Robinson of Color of Change tells us, it's not democracy that leads us to a racially just society. It is a racially just society that leads us to a true democracy. And we have to think about what that means as we think about all the questions that we engage around. I think one of the things I thought about the most in pulling together these comments was, would law students care about philanthropy? How do you think about philanthropy? In my experience in speaking to law students at NYU and other places, one of the challenges is, particularly for public interest and people who want to be public interest lawyers, there's not a lot of conversation about the ecosystem that actually funds and supports public interest law. Now, we know that most nonprofits are funded by government, and government provides most of the funding to nonprofits, except in the area of advocacy. Advocacy and engagement is almost entirely a function of funding by philanthropy. And that means when we go into philanthropic circles, whether or not people have had experience in the world, have you ever litigated a case? Have you ever stood up in court? What is the experiences that you've had in the world that help inform and shape the actual support and networks for civil society? These are huge questions. And when I entered philanthropy almost 10 years ago, I remember the first time I walked into the room with a set of national funders. Presidents of foundations, large divisions, directors like myself. I was the only person of color in the room. And I was the only person, as far as I knew, that had actually come from the field. 10 years later, that has changed, but not as much as one would hope. And the ability to understand the distinction of shaping this space is why I hope to speak to you all specifically from the lens of what does it mean to engage around these questions of our democracy, our economy, racial justice, and thinking about what does it mean to shape and work in partnership with the people who actually do most of the work. I remember when I first started in philanthropy, people would say, what do you do? I'm like, I used to do things, now I'm in philanthropy. Right? I used to actually, and so it's kind of true and kind of not. The work I do is very different, but still important. Philanthropy has its limitations and its benefits. The ability to connect with and shape advocacy and reform sectors is huge. Having different people in those spaces, understanding different experiences is essential to how that space is shaped. But there are four primary limitations I see to philanthropy seeking to support transformative change. The first, philanthropic institutions are not liberatory in nature, right? For the most part, old white money trying to support old white systems, right? Those interventions have to look different, and that means who shows up in those spaces, and that matters. Systemic challenges can't be solely addressed by rules changes. The desire to check a box, oh, we got that legislation passed, this thing got done, is actually insufficient to agree systemic change. That new systems will recalcify old problems if created without intention to address paradigms based in white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And finally, limited resources must be tactically focused to address the most effective forms of engagement. What does that mean? Much of the work, particularly in the democratic practice space, is painfully unsexy. No one rallies for redistricting, like nobody. It doesn't happen. People engage around the issues that animate their lives. So you're trying to affect systemic change by supporting systems and processes that actually animate people. And this can be a real tricky bit of business. But these are challenges and limitations to these approaches. And I want to give you an example. After World War II, the NAACP was having an internal debate. Do they continue to fight their anti-lynching campaign? Or do they focus on systemic approaches around ending de jure segregation, particularly in schools? Have people seen that sign hanging out the NAACP office? It's an old black and white photo, but it's everywhere. And it says, "A man was lynched today," right? NAACP in their offices would hang that flag out every time there was a lynching in the United States. And they fought hard to end lynching. But they had to decide what to do. They had to figure out where the resources were and what would produce the greatest outcomes. When trying to make this decision, they ultimately decided, as we know through Brown v. Board of Education, to pursue education desegregation. But when we look at the research by Megan Ming Francis, she reminds us that the Garland Fund, which had funded the NAACP, cared very deeply about education, and believed firmly that the opportunity for Black Americans in the United States was through educational opportunity, and that's what the Garland Fund wanted to fund. And so NAACP shifted its focus, moved away from lynching and moved into educational desegregation. Now, as we are aware, Brown 2, all deliberate speed, and the fact that we still have many of those same school systems just as segregated today as they were. We can't undo and rewrite the past, but it does call into question, would Black Lives Matter today differently if NAACP had remained focused on lynching and terrorism in the United States? Was this a form of movement capture by philanthropy? How do we think about these interventions and where they come from? So I want to spend our time today, I feel like I've sort of grounded you in sort of our approach and interventions. I want to spend some time today speaking to the necessary vision related to our economy, our democracy, and to racial justice. And then I want to turn very specifically to the democratic challenges related to voting rights, redistricting, misinformation, disinformation, ballot access, and attacks on election administration. So first of all, we know that the current US political economy is built on a 20th century set of paradigms rooted in neoliberalism and racial liberalism. The Roosevelt Institute tells us in a recent study that both neoliberalism and racial liberalism have failed by their own measures, right? Left to their own devices, corporations did not bring growth or shared prosperity. They did not reduce education, racism in labor markets, or in American life. Racial liberalism's focus on anti-discrimination and access to existing systems has been insufficient to overcome centuries of racial oppression. So as we consider what it takes to build a multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic economy, we have to consider what it takes to support a democracy that the world has never seen. There is no roadmap for what we're trying to do now. Nowhere in modern democracies are there systems that are truly inclusive. No democracy that is not dependent upon exclusion and segregation of significant parts of their populace. This is true of Muslims in India, indigenous populations in Mexico, Black Americans in the United States, and I can go on and on. This is simply true. What we're seeking to accomplish, what we want to see, has never ever been done before. So how do we think about that? How do we think about what those interventions were? And we know that the fight for voting rights and ballot access is essential, necessary, and insufficient. We can see within our political system right now, without any changes, right, that we can reach the goal where voter registration is eliminated. Do recall that voter registration is suppressive in and of itself, right? The act of having to register to vote was actually created to limit who could access the ballot in the first place. That every eligible citizen or resident that seeks to cast a vote is able to do so, and that every properly cast vote is counted. We can quickly see how gerrymandered districts, outsized influences of economic elites, state-sponsored election theft could easily undermine all the efforts that it took to get these people to the polls. And in some cases, gerrymandering can be outdone by turnout, but prison-based gerrymandering, absolutely ineffective. It doesn't matter what you've done. It bakes in underrepresentation and misrepresentation in the process. There must be a wholesale effort and consideration of how to transform our democracy to make sure that the efforts of our voting rights teams, our voting rights access, our voting rights people are actually accomplishing the goals they seek to accomplish. And moreover, we must acknowledge what neoliberalism and racial liberalism never did. That race, economy, and democracy are inextricably linked, and we have to intentionally reshape institutions and systems that shape our economic and rules and institutions. And those same rules and institutions often drive racist outcomes. These things are together, and we have to think of them that way. So I want to speak first about a vision for a new economy. I'm going to try first some visioning, right? What do we want to see? What do we need to see? And what are the challenges to the vision before we go into the deep mire of all the challenges we see every day when we, I was about to say open the paper, but that was a very, so currently we have what is largely an unregulated capitalist system. Capital is central, private decisions may control, and free markets are treated like a natural force. We can make more money through rent-seeking activities than we can through the sale of exchange of labor or knowledge. Our capital system is characterized by private ownership and distribution of goods that are mainly determined by competition in a free market. But there is an alternative. And it's something that I've not so cleverly labeled societalism, right? It's an economic system with society at center instead of capital, right? It's characterized by honoring humanity and controlled by an egalitarian democracy. It's one that permits private ownership, but elevates cooperative ownership. Thinking about capital goods, investments are shaped by public policy with a core value of environmental sustainability. Prices, production, distribution of goods are determined by a regulated market. And public expenditures determine public access to key and quality infrastructure. And there are six core values to achieve this goal. First, humanity is central. The express rejection of so-called caste systems and stratified economic structures must exist. Two, environmental sustainability is a core value. The policy preference for private ownership tends towards cooperative ownership and other protective processes to eliminate generational wealth hoarding. Scope of permitted investments are determined by public policy. Prices, production, and distribution of goods are determined by a regulated market. And public expenditures determine access to key and quality infrastructure, quality healthcare, public transportation, broadband access, roadways and transportation, and living wage, all determined by public infrastructure choices. To migrate to a new economic paradigm, however, it's essential to correct for impacts to populations subjugated from social caste and economic systems that are created today. The legal framework and understanding of antitrust will matter a great deal in the reshaping of the economy. In addition, we must also consider not only how the government engages in expenditures, but also how private and public sectors are funded. If private markets remain extractive and public taxation regressive, no amount of spending, right? We have a lot of talk about equitable democracies. How much do we spend on housing? How much do we spend on education? How much do we spend on infrastructure? But if the way we raise those dollars is extractive, and regressive, you cannot create equity on the back end, right? These are the policy questions that are created and that we as lawyers have to consider as we support and provide technical assistance to communities and in spaces. And finally, to move from an extractive to sustainable economy, there must be attention for reconciliation who suffered the most. Reparative strategies and transitional justice are essential for move to one phase to the next. You cannot jump from everything doesn't work to a perfect place without a pathway in between. And we have to sincerely focus on reparative strategies and transitional justice as a pathway for that work. Now, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, our democracy and peace team, is engaging in a study as to whether or not reparative strategies and transitional justice are actually necessary to achieve true democracy and durable peace. Because we have to ask the question. Otherwise, legitimately, the answer yes doesn't matter if the answer couldn't be no. And we are engaging it in with all the jurisdictions where we operate. So that includes the United States, the Northern Triangle of Central America, Israel, Palestine, Afghanistan. And we're observing all of these jurisdictions. We're doing studies in these jurisdictions to try and ascertain to answer the question. I think I know the answer. You can ask my wife, I think I have all the answers. But I do think it's essential that we actually are rigorous and examine these questions, that we don't just move on principles and ideas and concepts that are untested and unproven. We have to be able to put our ideas to the same kind of test and rigor that we look at other folks and say, you haven't done this. And the privilege of philanthropy is we can decide we're going to do it and we can fund it and do it. And it is a privilege. So what relationship then to democracy and the law and how we think about these kinds of engagements? I would argue here that I'm not sure the systems in our democracy were actually ever designed to function for today. Our democratic systems for the United States were developed for a relatively small agrarian nation with sharply limited suffrage and an economic system based on the enslavement of Black people. We are now a huge, extremely diverse country with a financialized and information-based economy that has outlawed slavery and indentured servitude, all except for prisoners and in de facto matter undocumented persons. We have guns that allow single actors to kill dozens of people in seconds, and information and communication systems that move exponentially faster. We are no longer in any practical, meaningful way the structures and systems that the initial design of the systems in our democracy were intended to regulate, engage through, and around. We have to consider what needs to change, even if you were to set aside the isms and the sexism and the racism. We're only going to set them aside for a moment. We're going to come back. If we set them aside entirely, there are legitimate questions as to whether or not the system still works. Right now, every congressperson represents 800,000 people, and they run for election every 18 months. If we're lucky, if they're in a highly competitive district, they're running for election every year, and they're raising extraordinary amounts of money to do so. How is it possible for one office, one individual to fairly assess and understand, get feedback, give feedback, and actually adequately represent a congressional district of 800,000 people? We have to question at its core things like, is the size of Congress the right size? Is it the right number of people? Should we be having single member districts? Right? We have some real questions about how we engage. Our political engagement is still based on our geography, our power. Who else is in our district? Who else is in our voting precinct? Who's in our city council district? But if your life is anything like mine, I extract my political power and relationship, and my political home have no relationship necessarily to my geographic residence. The ability to engage digitally across large areas to actually create political homes that look different. When I say political home, I mean, this is a group I belong to, that I will either act or forbear from acting based solely upon my understanding of your participation in that same group. I know you're going to ask me to do something, I'm going to do it. Not because I know you, but because we're part of the same political home. And the political home that people reside in often are extremely disconnected from the levers where we exercise power. And this has caused massive suffering in terms of engagement, particularly around local elections. I got a little off track. I didn't even write that down. I just threw it in there. Now I got to find myself again. I apologize. So we have to think broadly about reforms that feel radical, but maybe aren't. What does it mean to have a country that was designed never to have complete suffrage and never to be truly majoritarian in its democratic assessment? What does the judicial review as defined by Marbury versus Madison actually mean in that sense? Is that appropriate? Is it not? I don't suggest throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there are reasonable arguments to think about what does it mean to be a truly majoritarian democracy in a different kind of context, and whether and how the court is exercising control. And we can't lose sight of the fact we are engaging in many of these 20th century fights in a new context, and that our constitutional jurisprudence has to contemplate a new future. Yet the structure of law, the rules of interpretation, stare decisis, all command that interpretation is dependent upon past rationale. Understanding the political process is not separate from results in policy and government, right? The other challenge with political reform is we often hear things like, what about ranked choice voting? Let's change the size of Congress. Let's do these things. But they're separated and segregated from the notions of actual governance. But that's actually how people understand how their democracy works. If you ask normal, non-lawyer people, how do they know if their democracy is working? What do they say? I can get a job. My kids can go back and forth to school safely. I don't have to worry about gangs. I don't have to worry about cops. I know my kids can get home safely. The measures of how people understand a functional democracy has little to do with the mechanism involved and how their ballot is counted. It has to do with how governance is executed and achieved. So every time we think about these questions of reform, reformation, engagement strategies, however we think about it, we have to remember that how people show up, how people understand how they show up, is within these spaces. So I'm going to skip ahead because I'm looking at the time. And I just want to talk about race just a teeny bit more. I want, not because it's the least important thing before we turn to challenges, but because it's the most important notion that's the most durable, and we have to think about the way we engage around it. So if I may diverge, I want to start making some clarifications and what does it mean to engage around racial questions and racial challenges. We have DEIA strategies, right? Those tend to be more numerical head count, who's in the room. We're not necessarily worried about integration of ideas and things like that. There's some elements of that, but it's primarily a representational method, right? As different from racial equity. This is when we're often looking at POC populations as against white people, right? And we're trying to figure out what does equity look like and how do we achieve outcomes, right? Equity cares nothing for your intentions. I didn't intend to discriminate. I intended to do better. Doesn't matter. Equity is about what is the outcome, what is happening, and it's primarily between folks of color and white folks. As we think about racial justice, the notion of actual justice, righting of past racial wrongs, looking at transitional justice strategies and truth-telling. What does it mean to bring justice into the conversation to actually have outcomes that feel fair? They may or may not, and oftentimes cannot be driven solely by economic or measurable tit-for-tat outcomes. And then we have the actual focus on what Black people or Latinx people or API populations or Native populations actually need. And these are pro-Black strategies. pro-Latinx strategies, pro-Asian strategies. This is about looking at the conditions, context, and culture of a community and deciding what needs to happen. It is not as compared to white folks. It's not anything else saying, I'm looking at this community and seeing what needs to be done, right? And these are legitimate pro-Black, pro-Latinx, pro-Native strategies. That's different from the other three things we talked about. And then I'm going to name the last thing, which I tend to call, it's not super gracious, white people work, okay? And this is addressing and understanding the centrality and normativity of whiteness and the impact of the same on individuals, but not just individuals, but the systems and structures that make up our society. And how anti-Black racism is at the root of all racism. The core defining antithesis of whiteness that implicates the experience of all non-white people in the United States and in the Americas. So I just wanted to set that frame. So we had sort of a structure. Not everyone's going to agree with me. I think it's a reasonable structure. These things aren't, I tend to describe things in very categorical ways. They're really Venn diagrams, right? There's slop over in each one, but I think it's a fair way to think about approaches to work, and some do have to be approached in a very clean sort of way. And it is important as we support work in the world, what are we seeking to achieve? Can the goals we seek to achieve be accomplished by the methods we're seeking to go, right? So many times you see people saying, well, I want to work on systemic racism. What are you doing? Well, I'm staging a series of conversations in the community so people can get to know each other better and understand how to operate. That's wonderful, but they are not institutional or systemic approaches. And when you use strategies that are targeted to individuals and say it's about systems, if you use strategies that are targeted to systems and say it's about institutions, you're going to get a whole lot of muck in the middle. And it's absolutely incredibly important to figure out what is the tactic that you're using to achieve the goals, not just, is there broadly good work being done? In philanthropy, the hardest thing about it is we have to say no more than anything, and we say no to people doing good work all the time. But one of the challenges I see a lot are people saying, we're doing really good work, and we're working with other people doing really good work, and then there's this big black box, and then there's change. And it's not targeted. There's not a rationale. There's not a reason to understand why the things you're doing should lead to the outcomes that you want to see in the world. We just know they're good things to do. There has to be a connection. There has to be a nexus. To understand how explicitly anti-democratic desires can be framed as defending freedom, as well as how moderate and left responses to political violence seem to underestimate the continuity of the past and the threat to the future, we have to grapple with the foundational role of white supremacy and white normativity in our republic. The elevation of anti-CRT movements is more of the same. The acute denial of history and removal of facts. Author and thought leader Heather McGhee, who wrote the book Some of Us, if you haven't had a chance to read it, never mind, I'm talking to law students, don't worry about it. Listen to the blog, just listen to the podcast when you're on the thing. If you have actual time to read something and you're not going cross-eyed, it's a great book to pick up. Heather has written upon extensively on how racialized policies harms the US as a whole, and shared healing and reconciliation is necessary to move forward. There are many valid and legitimate points of entry on how race can be integrated into strategies to support and advance transformation, democratic and economic change. But to be transformative, race must be an express consideration. There is no way around it. You cannot talk about reforming systems in the United States about representation or opportunity and not talk about race. I'll stop. So what I'd like to do now is turn to the myriad challenges facing US democracy. And when I think about this, I am struck by a colleague who I worked with, when I was on the voting rights side and became a grantee when I went to philanthropy. And one day he came into my office and I was like, how are you doing? He's like, I'm exhausted. He'd been doing voting rights work since I'd been alive. And he said, I knew there would always be fights. I did not think we'd be fighting the exact same fights 30 years later. I did not think we would still be fighting the exact same types of ballot access, vote suppression, these issues 30 years later. And I think about that a lot when I think about how we engage around these questions. The fight to keep economic, legal, and social frameworks is being fought across every aspect of the democratic field. This is also true of criminal justice, immigration, reproductive rights, First Amendment spaces. And we're going to talk about more of that in the panel later this week. We've got some really amazing participants. When we think about the things that are really confronting our democracy, rising authoritarianism is exerting a powerful and damaging impact on our democracy. Efforts to undermine the rule of law, subvert the voting process, and debilitate the separation of powers are taking hold at both national and state levels. Violence is increasingly perceived as a viable alternative to democratic norms, practices, and institutions, with the most distressing development being, of course, the January 6th insurgency. While not the first or only domestic insurgency since the 1800s, it was, of course, the largest, and there were 4 aspects of it that were particularly devastating. It was the first one incited by the President of the United States. The scale and scope was larger than ever before. And the degree of planning and preparation across that scale and scope was also unprecedented for domestic attack. And the number of casualties were higher than any other similar incident, with 5 people dying directly from the attacks and 4 more killed by suicide following the attacks. The big lie has become a systemic and persistent global disinformation issue and a tool invoked to thwart our developing multiracial democracy. And the movement of the big lie and other aspects of misinformation through the US and international elections is an enormous threat to democracy. The speed and scale which age-old patterns and practices misinform and change is a global threat. Right? These aren't new ideas. Telling people lies about who you want to, that's not new. But again, scale, scope, speed, breadth, reach, inability to check ideas and notions, no shared public dialogue. This is actually one of the biggest changes that we see. And in 2016, the US presidential election reflected the global patterns in misinformation. The 2016 intrusions on the elections, particularly in the digital space on misinformation, did not start in the US. This was a global pattern that had been pulled through. And it raised the alarm. DHS is now an essential actor in US elections, a big partner that we sit with at tables all the time in dealing with election security questions. And FYI, in 2024, the 2024 global election cycle is actually one of the biggest challenges to elected preparedness for collective democracies. The world, for the first time, some of the world's largest democracies will be having head of state elections at the same time. And the ability to synchronize misinformation across these elections presents a global threat that we haven't seen before. And so I'll just name a few of them that are having just heads of state elections. The US, the UK, India, Indonesia, Ukraine, and Taiwan. In addition to the heads of state elections, full parliamentary elections and legislative elections in the EU, Mexico, and the United States. This is massive. If you think about what happened in the US in 2016, misinformation and disinformation, take that global across all democracies. The risk for supporting authoritarian interventions in these states is massive and something we have to pay very close attention to. One of my colleagues who I sit on a different board with, Katie Harbath, she's a former global election director at Facebook, has actually taken up this charge over the next few years. I know the irony. The United States is experiencing high-risk threats to elections themselves. Democratic institutions have become more vulnerable to election sabotage, owing to an erosion of trust, crises of legitimacy that existed long before Trump. Non-compliance with the law and practices, attacks on nonpartisan election administration, and threats and intimidation of election officials. And civil society remains under-equipped to counter these threats. As the threats of violence increases, there's a lack of local leadership as well as a really inconsistent analysis of what causes these problems. Corporate America has yet to place its markers on the side of inclusive democracy. They will take out full-page ads, but they will still fund people engaging in these practices on the state and official levels. We're now seeing the creation of election policing departments. Georgia, Arizona, and Florida have all proposed policing departments that will actually work within the secretaries of states with armed officers to enforce election laws. It doesn't look like we'll see passage of these efforts in Arizona or Florida or Georgia, but in Florida, DeSantis has written $5.7 million into his budget for this very purpose. We're seeing new attacks and consistent attacks through redistricting on Black, Latino, Asian, and Native communities. This is my third redistricting cycle. I know you say you're too young, it's true. And again, I look at this, I'm like, it's still the same fights. We're still battling these same challenges. We are now seeing significant concerns or lawsuits raised in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Ohio, South Carolina, and Texas, and that's just so far. We know that we're going to see challenges to failure to create Black opportunity districts in Alabama and North Carolina, and failure to create Latino opportunity districts in Texas. Part of the root of this problem, of course, is the Supreme Court decision, Rucho v. Common Cause, right? The Rucho decision said, yep, discrimination and redistricting based on race remains unconstitutional, but partisan gerrymandering, this is something the court isn't going to be able to touch. Justice Kagan's dissent, and I'm going to read here, argued that the court has the power to establish a standard for adjudicating unconstitutionally excessive partisan gerrymandering, and the abdication of its obligation to do so may, quote, irreparably damage our system of government, end quote. We're seeing some state level successful redistricting forms, but not everywhere. Michigan went pretty well. Utah and New York saw legislatures reject the plans from the redistricting commissions over and over and over again and take the redistricting back into the legislative process. And that partisanship that is born out of those types of redistricting practices results in things like the failure of the Freedom to Vote Act, the failure of the John Lewis Act. Most voting rights work is designed to protect the vote and defend rights, with extraordinary effort focused around ballot access and representational issues. But there are things we have to do. We have to counter election sabotage, secure and safeguard elections, processes, and hold accountable those who undermine the integrity of our election and democracy. To build field infrastructure to prepare for crises. This can't be done by handfuls of lawyers on the coast. This has to be nationwide infrastructure that's supported, built, and engaged around the country. Disinformation and misinformation do have policy solutions, prohibiting discriminatory algorithms, protecting external researchers, strengthening local media, and passing comprehensive data privacy legislation. Still, however, there's not a lot of bipartisan support for these efforts. There is something, though, I think that I don't know that we're paying a lot of attention to, and that, of course, is the executive orders passed by the current administration. These present great opportunity if implemented properly. We are seeing strong efforts. It's expensive. They're extremely dependent on something called IPAs. You guys know what that is? Okay. This is where some external factor, private philanthropy, pays for an individual to go work inside federal government to actually execute on a very particular activity. And we're seeing IPAs being deployed around the following executive orders and others: racial equity and underrepresented populations, the diversity and accessibility, EO, the EO are on the NVRA, the National Voting Rights Act, anti-competition, antitrust, corporate consolidation, the FEC, FCC one, and the restoration of net neutrality. I have to say, however, I have a moral challenge to spending tax-free dollars to fund work inside the government. Like, it's actually, I don't think, the greatest use of money, but the biggest challenge is when we're talking about doing things that functionally change the culture of bureaucracies, you oftentimes need to put people at the center that can facilitate that change in a very fast period of time, because if we lose the power of the White House, it's lost. So the ability to facilitate processes, make change for the administration and the agencies that have now been tasked to do things like understand the racial impact of their policy execution, right? And a lot of people don't know that IPAs are actual jobs. They're research level jobs, some are senior level positions, but they're opportunities to actually effectuate change. We already have the power to get it done. It's just a question of getting it done. I make that sound like it's not a big deal. It's still a hell of a lot of work, and there's no guarantee that it will stick. But we know it sometimes moves faster with somebody on the inside at least trying than everything being external. We have other federal reforms, changing the size of House Representative. Election workers faced with menacing messages and threats. The Justice Department is now starting to make arrests. Equitably driven reforms like democracy vouchers, ranked choice voting, multi-member districts are all important but limited by governance challenges. The challenges and potential for new democratic vision cannot be limited to technical reforms. It must be part of a transformed political economy if the union is to survive. Continued economic instability and inequality is unsustainable and cannot support a true democratic country, but will require an autocratic government to maintain control through force rather than consent. The old is dead. The arc of history bends towards justice. We see neoliberal and racial liberalism as twin failures. Archaic notions of power being held by certain actors based on race and gender are failing. Yet the dead hand of the past continues to guide our policy and engagement, with so many believing, expressly or implied, that any candidate supported by the majority of white people must be the winning candidate. That markets alone hold promise for prosperity, and that unspoken assumptions about people based on their race, country of origin, or ability should determine the opportunities for the future. We must always keep in mind the inextricable nature of democracy, economy, and race as we birth a shared vision for a future inclusive democracy. Thank you.